have to turn the audio on. Where's that?
So, how are we doing?
It's live, yeah, it's recorded.
Yeah, we've got a few people tuned in abroad, have we?
Penny Asa was asking, not yet, no.
Lovely, okay.
No, just me.
Good, anyway, just turn around to face you all.
Are you logged in as FFWPU? You can chat.
Welcome everybody. Anyway, so as I said last week, I finished basically going through all the principle, and so I've got to look at some little extra bits and pieces to the rest of the summer. This one is about science and religion. So sometimes you get people think that science and religion have always been in conflict. Sometimes people think they're in harmony. So I want to try and look at this question of the relationship between science and religion and whether they need each other or not. Anyway, the reality is that human beings ask questions. So, for example, you can imagine, before people living in houses and with electricity and computer games and television, they used to sit around the campfire and ask themselves, why does the sun rise and set? And it's a question. How does it do it? Why does it do it? How does it do it? And people came up with all sorts of theories to try and explain the fact the sun starts off on one side of the sky and ends up on the other side, and it disappears and comes back over there again. And it's a bit of a mystery if you don't know how, if you didn't have the kind of education we got today. Again, people often ask about raining. Does it need rain for the crops? So when is it going to rain? And then people sometimes ask the question, why isn't it raining? And then how can we make it rain? And so people would develop rain dances. Again, to try and think, how can we control the natural world? How can we have control of the nature so that nature does what we want it to do? So, break dances then are a very primitive form of technology in that sense. It's based upon a certain understanding of the way the world is. Then again, sometimes people ask, why is there a universe? Why do people suffer? And this is Virgil, who was a Latin poet, Roman poet, said, happy is he who gets to know the reason for things. So when we discover the answer to our questions, then we experience happiness based on our understanding. So traditionally, then, people have always tried to make sense of the world in which they live. And so to help do this, then religion, science, philosophy developed to answer such questions. And originally there weren't separate subjects like religion, science and philosophy. These separate subjects have only developed very recently in the last 150 or 200 years. A couple of hundred years ago, people didn't think, oh, I'm a scientist or I'm a philosopher. All these things are just integrated as people tried to make sense of the world. So the first astronomers were priests, so you go along to Stonehenge, you can see a picture of that, and you can see not only was it to do with trying to work out the calendar, but also people assume it has some kind of religious function. And so there's no separation between religion and science. And then medicine men, who were doctors, were also prophets and physicians. And so you get in some countries today, you still have a shaman who is involved with medicine and herbal medicines and things, but is also some kind of spiritual guide as well. Again, it's no different. And so, as I said, traditionally people have always strove for an integrated explanation of things. And so the usual relationship between what we now call science and religion has been one of cooperation and interaction. So, for example, Thomas Aquinas, who was one of the greatest of the medieval schoolmen, he tried to combine Christianity, theology or religion, together with Aristotelian thought, which was sort of the scientific way of looking at things, which was inherited from the Greeks, and trying to synthesize these two together. And then the Benedictines, Dominicans, Franciscans, Jesuits, these are all different Catholic orders, and these were the scientific leaders. And so all these Catholic orders, these monks basically, a lot of them were very intelligent, interested in philosophy, but also interested in science. And the scientific leaders of the medieval world came from the monasteries, from these Catholic orders. And scientists also, who weren't monks or members of religious orders, they were also supported by the church. The church recognized the value of science, and scientists were Christians, and Christians were scientists. There was no, And yes, also many of the more recent of the great scientists have also been believers, like Galileo, Kepler, who, anybody know what Kepler discovered? No? Okay, Galileo discovered various things. Anyway, he took up the sort of sun-centered view of the solar system, to argue that the planets went around the sun. And Kepler said actually it didn't go around the sun in a circular orbit, but actually the orbit with sort of oval shapes. And so he came up with the orbitary, explain that. And then, but also, you know, one of his ways of trying to explain this was, what was it called now? The music of the spheres. So he thought that each planet played a certain tune as it went around, and the whole thing was a great musical symphony of the planets. Interesting idea, sort of very primitive idea, viewed as string theory, I suppose. Anyway, and Newton also, you know, discovered the laws of gravity and did a lot of work in calculus. He also wrote large commentaries upon the Bible. He's also very much interested in alchemy, and he thought that his religious ideas would be the ones that people would be studying in a couple of hundred years' time, and the scientific ideas were not as insignificant. And then Maxwell, who was a very religious person, who discovered the equations linking of electromagnetism as far as we know. Please correct me if I get it wrong. Anyway, so you get some great scientists. These are some quotes. This is Galileo. Mathematics is a language in which God has written the universe. How are we doing? Is it working?
Yeah, we're pretty much there.
Brilliant, okay. So, is there anybody around the cosmos I could welcome and greet?
Not right now, no.
This is 3 people.
Oh yeah. It's
2, it's 2.
So,
I don't have the chat.
Oh, okay.
That's right. Last time they were all 87 people scattered around the
I think it takes
internet.
I think it takes a little time for the people to log in. Yeah.
We're a bit late starting as well. Yeah, it says Galileo, mathematics is the language in which God has written the universe. And that's one of his main insights, actually. Galileo was one of the most enduring insights was that it's through mathematics that we could make sense of the natural world. And so, and so this is Louis Pasteur, who discovered, about pasteurized milk, bacteria and things. And he said that through science brings men nearer to God, he said. And then this is Joule, who worked in the sphere of physics and energy, so you've got one of the units for energy is the Joule. It's evident that an acquaintance with the natural laws means no less than an acquaintance with the mind of God therein expressed. So this is, as I said, this is the normal relationship between science and religion, between scientists and their understanding of God and the religious world. So sometimes, people will tell you that science and religion have always been in conflict, but actually it's not true. It's not normal at all. So what is science then? Science is a human endeavour to discover the structure of the world and the laws that govern its working. So it's a human endeavour to make sense of the world in which we live and the laws that govern the workings of the natural world. It's also a spiritual adventure. It's an activity of the mind, an activity of the spirit, an activity of the imagination. Yeah? Trying to make sense of these things, develop theories to try to explain what's going on. And so this is Claude Bernard. He's a French physiologist. So the joy of discovery is certainly the liveliest that the mind of man can ever feel. And so it's a spiritual activity, science. And it's also a communal enterprise. So scientists often work together. Even if they work apart, then they write papers and they share their discoveries with other scientists, and other scientists will review them and try and replicate those experiments, and so you have this idea of peer review. So science then is a communal enterprise. And what makes scientists tick? Well, this is Einstein. He says, I want to know how God created this world. Now, Einstein didn't believe that in a personal God, it was possible to have a personal relationship with God. His idea of God was not a Christian idea of God, but anyway, that's what made him tick. His idea of God is what motivated him. And again, this is a Nobel Prize winner, Sybil Hinchelwood. Science is an imaginative adventure of the mind, seeking truth in a world of mystery. Again, this sense of mystery of the world in which we live, and trying to make sense of it. So this is a scientific endeavour. And scientific method is scientists search for patterns and laws to explain the hidden order underlying the natural world. So see the world in which you live, it sometimes looks very chaotic, but they have this intuition that behind this apparent chaos there's some sort of order, and they're trying to discover the natural order which underpins the whole reality, and these laws and patterns. They might do is they might notice something which is unusual or puzzling, then develop a hypothesis. So Newton apparently saw an apple falling. Wonder what's interesting. People have always noticed it, but they didn't actually notice it in the way that he noticed it. They saw it, but they didn't notice it in that sense. So he noticed it. Oh, that's interesting. Develop a hypothesis, did experiments, accumulate evidence, develop a theory, test and try and disprove the theory. So good science tries to disprove theories. It's very easy to prove theories. Anybody can prove any whole theory, because you just find the evidence to support the theory. But good scientists, what they do is they try and prove that theory is wrong. And if they can't prove it wrong, then they say, well, maybe it's right. And then use models to explain phenomena. So, for example, what model do scientists use to try and explain about the way the atom is?
They split it.
What?
They split it. They split it.
They split what models? The very word split in itself is a metaphor to try and describe what they're doing. So what's a model of the atom? What is an atom like?
Stuff.
Sorry?
We can do round stuff.
Round stuff? Okay, so what's a sort of common model that's used to explain what an atom is? What's the common model that's used to explain what an atom is like? An atom is like a... Sometimes people say it's like the solar system. You've got the nucleus, which is like the sun. You've got electrons going around it. It's like the planets. Isn't that how they teach it at school? Or has it been a long time?
It's been a long time. Felt like a long time already.
Anyway, it's not really like that. It's not really like a solar system. It's not. But in order to try and create a picture of what an atom is like, people say it's like a miniature solar system.
Well, you've got to have something to visualise.
That's right, to help people visualise it. And once they visualise it, we say it's not really like that, because actually there aren't solid electrons, it's all a standing wave. But then using the word wave, again, it creates a picture of what it's like. Yes? Because, understand? So scientists use models to try to convey an image, a picture of what something's like, to try and convey understanding. Now am I making sense here? Anyway, so I don't know if you're interested in all this sort of stuff, but it interests me. So that's what I'm talking about. So what's the status of scientific knowledge? Well, one thing is it's tentative and it's not certain. So if you go to university or you go to school, when you look in the textbook, what do people usually look to try and find out? They usually often look at the front and they see, is it the latest edition? Yes. When was it published? Now supposing you were studying about the laws of gravity, and you had a copy of the book that Newton wrote about 200 years ago, I think. No, more like 300 years ago. What would you say? You want an updated version. You don't want an old edition of the science book from 300 years ago. You want the latest edition, wouldn't you? Okay. So generally speaking, the only thing you can say about scientific knowledge is what scientists believed 100 years ago has mostly been disproved, and they come up with new theories since then, or either been disproved or been modified. So scientific truth then is always very tentative, it's not certain. So when people study the Quran, it was written 1,600 years ago, about 1,400 years ago, and people want to have the original edition. Different kind of status, scripture, compared to scientific textbooks. Anyway, so all these theories then are all approximations to the truth. They're all approximations to describing the nature of reality. And they don't always fit together. For example, the theory of gravity, the theory of relativity, quantum theory. These are different theories, but they don't fit together yet. Yeah. And these scientific theories, as I said, they can't be proven. You can only fail to disprove it, but you can't actually prove it. And the other thing, which is completely certain, what we know is much less than what we don't know. So whatever we know about the universe in which we live is only a tiny fraction of the amount of knowledge which is there. Most things we just don't know. And so, that's the whole purpose of education. What do you think the purpose of education is? When you leave school, how do you think you should feel? Do you think you should feel educated or ignorant?
Relieved.
God, you are kind of student you are.
I suppose the proper answer is hungry for more knowledge.
Well, not necessarily hungry, but at least you should realise actually you don't know anything. If you leave school thinking you know a lot, actually you failed. You should leave school realising actually you know zilch compared to what you ought to know. So, for example, I remember when I studied history, I did my history O-level equivalent to GCSE. Then I sat the exam, and the exam was English history from 55 BC. What happened in 55 BC?
Something in the Roman.
Caveman.
I don't know, you did the exam.
When I was 15. Anyway, 55 BC, Julius Caesar landed on the shores of Britain. Okay. Julius Caesar?
Oh, Julius Caesar.
Yes, okay. And then, so the exam went from 55 BC up until 1914. What happened in 1914?
First World War.
Okay, First World War started. And so this English history then is divided up into about 10 periods, from 55 BC to 1914. And there's about 50 questions on the sheet of paper. And I started looking through these questions, I realised, actually, out of these 50 questions, I can only answer 5. And I realised that's because this particular period of English history is what I'd studied with my teacher. That was the period he was interested in, and that's the period he taught us about. So out of these 50 questions, I could answer 5 questions. Then I realised, even though I'd done really well in history, when I sat the exam, I realised I hardly know anything. There's only 5 questions that I can answer, and all the rest of it, I don't know anything about any of this. But also I became aware that even though I didn't know anything about these other 45 questions, in other parts of the country there were other children sitting the same exam who knew nothing about the 5 questions I could answer, but there was 5 questions they could answer from a different period. And then I realised that actually my head is too small to get all this knowledge from 55 BC to 1940 into my head. So all this knowledge has been parcelled up, and I studied this period. But in other parts of the country, other people were studying other periods. So the whole of English history is being studied by somebody around the country. So the whole of the knowledge was being anyway. So part of knowledge was being transmitted from one generation to the next. And so that's why you'd meet people who'd study, you'd sitting in a train, you might meet somebody who studied something very different than what you'd studied at school. Okay? So actually Britain 50 years ago, it was a much more interesting country. People were much more educated because everybody studied something different. But then they brought in the national curriculum, which everybody studies about Henry VIII and his 6 wives and Nazi Germany. And everybody studies that period, and that's all everybody studies. And so actually the country is becoming more ignorant. Yes? And so far less knowledge is being transmitted through the educational system today than was being transmitted through the educational system 30 years ago. So what the government is doing in this country is depriving people of their inheritance. It's leading to the destruction of English identity and English tradition. And English tradition and language and literature and culture and history is not being transmitted from one generation to the next. And so that's why you get all these young English children going and painting themselves with red and white, because they have this sort of empty nationalism, because they're out of touch with their English language, literature and history and culture, and so they just try and discover it in the flag. Yeah? So anyway, it's as a result of the national curriculum. And for example, the national curriculum people don't even study Alfred the Great. There's only one king in English history who's called the Great, it's Alfred the Great. So you think in the national curriculum you study about your nation's history, you'd think that would be one thing that people would study. But it's not in the national curriculum. No children at school study about Alfred the Great. So they've got no sense of what it was, what are the origins of the English people and the English nation. Anyway, we're talking about science here. Anyway, so what we know is much less than what we don't know. And so when we leave school, we should realise that. So what about the limitations of science? So sometimes people say, well, science can answer all the questions. If you have a scientific education, you can solve all the problems. We don't need to study history and religion and all these things. Science can answer all the questions. Well, let's have a look at some questions here. How are atom bombs made? Can a scientist answer that question? Come on, Joyce. Can a scientist answer the question, how is an atom bomb made?
I guess.
Uranium.
Yes, scientists who design and create atom bombs, yes, they can explain how an atom bomb works. But should we make an atom bomb? Can a scientist answer that question? Is that a scientific question?
No.
It's a moral question. It's not a scientific question. It's a moral question. How does a human organism function? Is that a scientific question? Yes. You explain it in terms of circulation, circulatory system, the blood circulation, all these sorts of things. What is the meaning of human existence?
No.
That's not you can look at a book about the human biology and you won't find the answer to that question there. That's a different kind of question, not a scientific question. It can't be answered by scientists. It's the sort of thing philosophers and religious people are interested in. How does a compact disc work? Yes. Technologists can explain that. Is it playing a CD of Coldplay enjoyable? It's not a scientific question, is it? There's no scientific answer to that question. So that's the point. Why are the laws of nature mathematical? Is that a scientific question?
No.
No. It's a philosophical question which is very connected to what are the foundations of science, which I mentioned Galileo was interested in. Why do the laws of nature exist? Is that a scientific question? No. It's a philosophical question. Okay, so let's have a look at religion then. We can see religion is very, very similar to science in many ways. So just as science is the quest to make sense of the natural world, religion is the quest to understand life's mysteries and discover the true way of life. So the life's mystery is such as, why do we exist? Why did God create me? Why did God create the universe? Why is there suffering? Why is there evil? What is right? What is wrong? These are different kinds of questions. How should I live my life so I can encounter God? How should I live my life so I can experience true happiness? So again, religion also is just as science is a spiritual venture, religion also is a spiritual adventure, one into the heart of God. And the methods of religion, you don't use microscopes and test tubes. The experiments you do are through prayer. And so through prayer, meditation, again you find this way and you discover all sorts of things. And so that's why Buddhism teaches about meditation, achieving enlightenment. And when you're enlightened, you're able to penetrate into the depths of reality and understand the nature of reality clearly. Because you have a very clear mind, clear insight, and you can see things clearly and accurately, instead of living in sort of fog and confusion. So just as scientists, they tune their instruments. So through prayer and meditation, we tune the spirit, again, to be able to find out the answer to these questions. And again, just as science is a communal activity, so is religion a communal activity. So you have people, you do have hermits who sit on, platforms on sticks in the middle of lakes in India, and you have other people that go and sit in caves, but generally speaking, most religious practices are communal. People worship together in a church. Muslims have the Ummah, again the Muslim community. Sangha, also have councils, so religion also is a communal activity. So what about some religious practices? So again, compared to scientific practices, religious knowledge is based upon experience and reason. And so people have experiences, so revelation is an experience with God. People have these experiences with God and they start to think about these experiences. So it's revelation, insights from profound encounters with the divine. And then people reflect upon these experiences of God and experiences of their life using their reason, and they develop theology. Yeah, so theology is a reflection upon the experience of God and life, and you develop all sorts of philosophies of life and theologies of life. And at the heart of reality, again, there's this mystery. So God is ultimately mysterious. No matter what we think we know about God, it's always wrong. God is beyond any human concept. God is beyond any language. God is beyond the words that we have. God is ultimately mysterious. Yes, in the way that the natural world, as you study it more and more, it's a mystery. The scientists realise it's actually a mystery, and they're trying to understand it, but they can never quite get a grasp on it. And so that's why, just as scientists use models to try and explain what an atom is like, and again, religious people use metaphors and similes to describe what God is like. God is a rock. No, not literally a rock, but like a rock in some ways. Okay, don't forget to stop me when I say something silly, or if you want to ask a question. So basically, science and religion are different. This is, as I said, this is the modern way of looking at things. Science and religion are different. The goal of science is understanding the lawful relations among natural phenomena, whereas a religion is a way of life within a larger framework of meaning. So they're different things. So to say that science disproves religion is to misunderstand it. They're different things. It's like saying, well, English literature means you don't need history. They're just different subjects, they're different areas of discovery, different areas of subjects of, and they're just different in that sense. Or another way of looking at the relationship between science and religion, the different areas of competence. So for example, you've got this little boy here in the bottom left-hand corner, and he comes into the kitchen and he sees it's a bit old-fashioned, but anyway, he sees a kettle boiling on the stove. And he asks his brother there, his big brother, why is the kettle boiling? And his big brother has just done finished his A-levels at school, and he thinks he's going to really impress his little brother with a proper explanation of why the kettle's boiling. So he explains, well, one day somebody went into the North Sea with a platform, they drilled this hole down into the North Sea, down into the ground, they discovered gas, and they piped the gas, and the gas came all the way along here and went through all these pipes. And then it came into this little pipe here into the kitchen, and they went into the stove, and then somebody switched on the tap, and they lit the gas with a flame, and then gas, which is CH4, methane, plus the oxygen in the atmosphere, it combines together, and it turns into CO2 plus H2O, and it liberates a lot of heat. And this heat, which is in these flames, it goes into the metal, and the metal transfers the heat very rapidly into the water, and the water molecules all start getting excited, and very excited, and suddenly some of them start to get so excited and get so energetic, they leap out of they're liberated from the water, and they come out as steam, and that's why the kettle is boiling. And the little boy is completely mystified. Anyway, so Mummy comes into the kitchen, and the little boy says, why is the kettle boiling? And Mummy says, it's tea time. So the same question, different answers. Both answers are correct. They're just a different type of explanation. So science focuses on explaining physical dimensions of reality, how, and religion focuses on explaining the spiritual dimension, why. So it's another way of understanding the relationship between science and religion. And so, also, this Freeman Dyson is a physicist. He said science and religion are two windows that people look through, trying to understand the big universe outside, trying to understand why we are here. They're just different ways of looking at reality, different windows through which you can make sense of reality. It's not that one window is correct and the other one's wrong. They're just complementary windows. And the more perspectives you have upon a certain problem, the more you can make sense of that problem, if you can see it from many different points of view. So what's the problem then? Well, Freeman Dyson said the trouble arises when either science or religion claims universal jurisdiction, when either religious dogma or scientific dogma claims to be infallible. So infallible means it knows everything. So religious creationists, these are people who believe, for example, that the earth was created in 6 literal days of 24 hours. Religious creationists and scientific materialists, so these are people that all scientific materialists are people who believe that all that exists is just material things. There's nothing other than what we can touch. Are equally dogmatic and insensitive. So, both of them are equally dogmatic and insensitive. So religious creationists would be the sort of fundamentalists that one sometimes finds, Christian fundamentalists, to say, evolution is incorrect because the Bible says God created the universe in 6 days, 24 hours long. And you get scientific materialists like Dawkins, who said, I can't remember his first name now.
Richard
Dawkins, who says that everything can be everything can be explained by evolution, and this disproves the Bible. This disproves the need for God as an explanation, and that religion is actually a bad thing. Religious ideas like a virus and all sorts of interesting ideas. Anyway, so let's have a look at some conflicts between religion and science. So as I said, traditionally there hasn't been a conflict between religion and science. Traditionally they've worked together. Traditionally, there have always been different ways of approaching and making sense of reality. Anyway, but sometimes people bring up two basic events. They always, when they say there's been a conflict between religion and science, they talk about the Galileo affair. And they say during the Galileo affair, the church rejected the facts that conflicted with theology and tried to suppress scientific theories. So Galileo was arguing that the earth went around the sun. Yes? Whereas there was the church, based upon Aristotle, who based his ideas upon Ptolemy, who was one of the greatest of the Egyptian astronomers, said actually the sun goes around the earth. The earth is at the centre of the solar system and everything goes around it. But the problem is they couldn't make sense of it, because the planets and everything was never in the right place at the right time. And so Copernicus came up with a different theory, trying to understand the way that the sun and the moon, and the earth and the other planets are related to each other, putting the sun at the centre and the planets going around. And this theory, it seemed to fit the facts better. It seemed to be a better explanation. And a lot of Catholic, the Pope, for example, before Galileo, thought this was a good idea. Anyway, there was sort of various political reasons. Galileo's ideas, which he was supporting the sun-centered universe, sun-centered solar system, came into conflict with other people who thought the Earth is at the centre, and there's a political controversy. And then the church said, actually, the Earth is at the centre, and the sun goes around it. Anyway, so that's an example of religious imperialism, trying to suppress scientific theories, rejecting the facts. Also you get scientific imperialism like neo-Darwinism, which claims, some people like Dawkins claim that evolution disproves the existence of God. But actually the existence or non-existence of God is not a scientific question. Scientists can't prove whether God exists or doesn't exist. It's not a scientific question. So, so that's why it's an example of scientific imperialism to claim that a scientific theory disproves God exists, because this isn't a scientific question. So it can't prove it or disprove it. It's imperialistic. Just as whether the sun goes around the earth or the earth goes around the sun, that's not a religious question. It's not a question that can be decided by a religious dogma or the church. This is a scientific question to do with facts. Oh, you want to look at me a bit? Okay. Anyway, so basically, what is the correct relationship between science and religion? Well, if we want, we should turn to the Pope, of course, because he got it right. Science can purify religion from error and superstition, and religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. And Einstein, well known to have said, science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. And so again, they need each other, they need to cooperate. And the unification view, if you're interested, for humanity to completely overcome the two aspects of ignorance, ignorance about the spiritual dimension of reality and ignorance about the natural world, there must emerge a new truth which can reconcile religion and science and resolve their problems in an integrated understanding, which, as I said, the integrated understanding is the traditional perspective. We have an integrated understanding. Yes. So the unification views an integrated understanding, reconciling religion and science, not falling into religious imperialism, which some people do. And so we finish this particular section. So again, science and values, Einstein again. Science can only ascertain what is, but not what should be. And outside of its domain, value judgments of all kinds remain necessary. So Einstein recognised then the difference between a scientific question and a moral or philosophical or religious question. They're different kinds of questions, and they need each other, complementary. So religion and philosophy are necessary to provide an ethical framework for science and its application. So for example, nowadays, and things like genetic engineering, use of the technology, and the way the environment is treated. Okay, so the next part of this talk is looking at God and the origin of the universe. Anybody here is interested in physics? No, there's a lot of physics in this, so you have to persevere, I'm afraid. Okay, so one of the questions that people, would sit around asking themselves, has the universe always existed? Has there always been a universe? People sit around, a campfire, wondering about this. Has there always been a world? Well, so most of these ideas are developed around campfires. Most serious theology is done on the street corner. When you're witnessing and talking to people who believe something different to you, trying to come up with an explanation which help them to understand what you're talking about. So, it's the question, if the universe has always existed, we do not need to explain its existence. If there's always been a universe, we can't explain its existence, we don't need to think about why it existed, because it's always been there, it's just a given. But if the universe hasn't always existed, we can ask, when did the universe begin? How did the universe begin? And why does the universe exist? So, scientific questions, which also lead into philosophical or religious kinds of questions. That's the key point, of everything really. Has the universe always existed? So the different perspectives on this. So Judaism, for example, Jewish perspective inherited by Christians and Muslims, is that God created the universe out of nothing. So there was nothing, there was God, and then God created the universe. It means the universe had a beginning. That's one perspective in the ancient world. Couldn't be proved. That was what people sitting around a campfire in the Middle East, that's what they came up with. Plato and the Greeks came up with a different idea. Plato, for example, he said that prime matter always existed. The reason is because nothing can come from nothing. So, for example, when you go along to a magic show and you see a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat, before he pulled the rabbit out of a hat, did the rabbit exist? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes, it did. Why? Because nothing can come from nothing. It's a trick. These things are tricks. It's magic in that sense is impossible. We know that it's not. They're amazing tricks, but they're tricks nevertheless because nothing can come from nothing. Okay. Right. No. Anyway. So Aristotle, coming on from Plato, he said God is eternal and unchanging. So the world is also eternal and unchanging. That's the conclusion he came from. God is eternal and unchanging, so the world is also eternal and unchanging, and therefore it's uncreated. And so he had this idea of ultimate higher, which is matter, which has always existed, and ultimate eidos, which is spirit, which has always existed. Okay, so the Jewish perspective is that there was God, and God created the universe had a beginning. The Greek perspective has always been the universe has always existed. There has always been matter. There was never a beginning of the universe. And so that perspective was the scientific perspective, generally speaking, that the universe has always existed. Because that was the conclusion of Greek philosophy and science. Anyway, so it wasn't actually up until the 1920s that there was any doubt of this. So the idea that God created the universe, this has always been a Jewish and Christian idea, but it was never an idea that was seriously entertained by scientists, because scientists coming out of the Greek philosophical tradition argued, well, nothing can come out of nothing, therefore the universe has always existed. And so there was never any question of who created it. Scientists weren't interested in that question because they said it wasn't created. It's always been there. Yeah? Anyway, so Edwin Hubble discovered that galaxies are moving away from each other. So this is when he was looking through his telescope and he discovered something called the redshift. Do you know this? That light moves, different colours of light move at different speeds. Yeah. Anyway, they do. Just as when you have an ambulance or police car going by, it sounds different when it's a long way away. As it gets closer and closer, when it's passing you, when it goes away, the sound is different. So you might think, well, what's going on there is a police car is changing the sound. As it approaches you, it's changing the sound. Well, it's not like that. It's emitting exactly the same sound, but you're hearing it differently. Yeah, because different sounds move at different speeds. Yeah. Make sense? Anyway, and so he discovered this redshift, and he realized that the universe is expanding. And he realized wherever he looked, he saw that galaxies were all moving away from each other. So if the universe is expanding, everything is moving away from each other, it means if you turn the clock back, eventually, it was all in one place. So just as if you have a balloon, and you have lots of spots on the balloon, and you blow the balloon up, all the spots are moving away from each other, aren't they? So he said this is the best way of making a best metaphor for the universe is a balloon. Universe like a great big balloon. It started off at nothing, and then it gradually expanded, and that's why it looks like all the galaxies are moving away from each other. And so therefore, they must have all started in the same place, which means the universe must have had a beginning. Now this is in the 1920s. It wasn't until the 1920s that scientists, based upon facts and evidence, came to the conclusion that the only way you can explain this is to say that the universe must have had a beginning. This is a huge shock for the scientific community. And do you think this was a welcome discovery or an unwelcome discovery?
I think unwelcome.
Why?
Because they have their theory, they've been disproved.
Right, the main reason is why it's unwelcome, because then the question is, what was before? If the universe had a beginning, that means who created it? Which of course brings God into science. There are a lot of scientists have been trying to squeeze God out of science. It wasn't necessary to their equations. They might have had their own personal faith and relationship with God and belief in God, but it wasn't in their equations. Anyway, so...
Surely that's only if they believed that God was a person. But if they sort of understood maybe or came to the conclusion that God, it could possibly be an energy, a force.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, how were they perceiving God in the first place to come to that conclusion? Do you understand
yes.
the question?
Right, yes, and they have different ideas about God. Often they would see that God is the creator. And
but do you see, if you see him as a man or
as a being,
then maybe that theory wouldn't stand. But if if you see him or see God as an energy, then that's a totally different way of thinking.
There are different ways of thinking.
Things.
I think as well that scientists are against the religious people, because religious people humanise God, and so they're not just looking at the facts of spirit or force, but they're actually fighting against the theory of plans.
Anyway, I said, most scientists have been Christians. It was just, there wasn't a lot of coincidence between their religious understanding and beliefs and the science which they were doing. Because the tradition of the science which they were doing, this tradition came out of Greek science and Greek philosophy, which had certain assumptions, such as nothing can come from nothing. That's the basic axiom of science, understanding. It was only much later these axioms were questioned. So that's why it was a bit of a shock. Anyway, so in 1963, there's somebody's name I can't remember, who worked for the Bell Laboratories in America. They were trying to tune their radio telescope to zero it. Before, it's just like when before you make a cake, you make sure the scales are at zero. Yes, before you start adding ingredients, otherwise you're going to get into a mess. So they were trying to zero their radio telescope And they thought, well, let's point it to a part of the universe where there's just blackness, there's nothing's there. And wherever they pointed it, they always found there was a source of radiation, which they called a background radiation. There was nowhere where they could point the radio telescope where there wasn't this background radiation. And it was always exactly the same frequency all around the universe. And they said, well, this radiation, which is the same frequency and sound strength or whatever everywhere in the universe, it must have had a common origin, because it's exactly the same frequency everywhere and strength. And so the only way it could have had a common origin was if it is a sort of echo of the Big Bang. And so this came to the idea that there was a huge explosion at the beginning of the universe, and this background radiation is a sort of echo of this Big Bang, a relic of it. And so there we are. This is a photograph of the universe taken quite recently.
Of the universe?
Well, kind of sort of put together by computers based upon lots of different pictures from telescopes.
What's outside of it then?
Well, it's expanding. And you see these sort of yellowy bits, they're supposed to somehow represent these, that's supposed to be our Milky Way, that sort of bit in the middle. And those bits around, the yellowy bits are supposed to be echoes of the Big Bang or something, background radiation. I can't really interpret it very well for you. Anyway, so the idea that there's a Big Bang, which is a singularity, it means it's a one-off event, which was infinitely small, infinitely dense, and infinitely hot, and sort of infinitely big. About 13 to 15 billion years ago, so it turned the sort of, like rewinding the video, and they got back to the starting point of about 13 to 15 billion years ago. And here we can see it, this sort of expanding universe. It started off from an infinitely small point and expanded over time. And there you can get sort of Rodin's thinker there, sitting right at the edge there. Yeah. So the inflating universe.
Some of them flying saucers.
Sorry?
Some of them flying.
Oh, well, that's just a brief history of the universe. If I can make it go back. So there's, right at the left-hand side there, you get the beginnings of the formations of particles.
Oh.
And as it goes out, you sort of get the beginnings of gases.
Oh,
And then you get the beginnings of galaxies, and the beginnings of solar systems, and then the beginnings of planets, and eventually you get human beings and things. So what happened at the Big Bang? Well, the Big Bang was when time and space started with the Big Bang. So sometimes people can ask the question, what was before the Big Bang? So from a scientific point of view, that question doesn't make any sense, because time started at the Big Bang, so there was no before the Big Bang. So the question, what was before the Big Bang, is a meaningless question, because there was no before, because that was the beginning of time. Time and space came into existence together. Yeah? So time started then, space started then. So the universe appeared with time, not in time. There wasn't a certain time, and then suddenly the universe appeared in time. Actually, the universe appeared with time. There was no time before the universe. So there's no before the Big Bang. Does that make sense? Okay, that's science. Okay, so sometimes people ask the question, well, okay, who created God? Yes, but again, that question also is a meaningless question. Just like the question, what was before the Big Bang, is a meaningless question. There is no answer to that question, not because it's a difficult question, because the question doesn't make sense. It's based upon a misunderstanding of what was going on. So just the same way, if you have a line, you can say, well, you can draw a straight line, you can ask the question, does this line have an end? Yes, it actually has two ends, the beginning, there's one end, and there's the other end. That question, where's the end of the line, where the ends of the line, is a question which has an answer. It's a meaningful question. But if you have a perfect circle, and you ask somebody, where's the beginning and end of the circle? Can they answer the question? Why not? Because by definition a circle has no beginning and no end. So if somebody keeps on saying, well, it must have a beginning and it must have an end, everything is a beginning and an end, what conclusion do you come to if they keep on pestering you to tell you say where the beginning and end of the circle is?
Like the F-25.
You know, you realise either they're strange, or they obviously didn't study very hard maths or geometry, because they obviously don't know what a circle is. And it's the same with God. People keep saying, well, who created God then? Well, it means they don't understand what the word God means, or what the concept God is. God is, by definition, God is eternal. By definition, God has no beginning and no end. By definition, God is beyond time and space. So to ask the question, who created God, suggests that God is within time. But God isn't within time, so the question doesn't make any sense. God wasn't created, because creation only takes place within time. And God is outside time. So the question is, it's a meaningless question. It just means they don't understand what the word God means. Yeah? So people often, pester and pester and pester. And, it's just the way it is. Okay. What happened to the Big Bang? That's what happened. So this is Stephen Hawking, Cambridge physicist, and he said science could predict that the universe must have had a beginning. Science can predict the universe must have had a beginning, but it could not predict how the universe should begin. For that, one would have to appeal to God. So you can predict that the universe has a beginning, but you can't predict that the universe will actually exist, or how it would, or that it should begin, or how it should begin. That's not a scientific thing. So what would you expect from a Big Bang? Well, supposing somebody put a stick of dynamite, underneath a building, what would you expect as a result?
Chaos.
What? It'd be a mess, wouldn't it? Yeah. There'd be bits that would be flying out all over the place. It would just be a mess. Yeah? It'd be disordered, random, kind of ugly after an explosion. Yeah? Supposing you stuck a stick of dynamite underneath a house and blew it up, and you found out when the dust had cleared, all the bricks had piled up together, all the pieces of wood from the door frames were all laid out, and all the nails had appeared in boxes. You'd be a bit surprised, wouldn't you? Shocked. Doesn't happen like that. So what is the universe like? Well, the universe, which is a result of this Big Bang, is a cosmos. It's not a chaos, it's a cosmos. It means it has order. It's orderly, it's incredibly complex, it's not random. And it's extraordinarily beautiful, it's not ugly. So it's a bit surprising, really. So let's have a look then at the initial conditions of the Big Bang. This is where all the sort of physics and science comes in. So, anyway, the first thing about the Big Bang was it was smooth. If you look at an explosion, set up some dynamite, blow something up, it's actually very ragged. In other words, there's lots of lumps of stuff. Yes? And there's lots of dust, and all this sort of debris has different sizes.
There would have had to have been a spark as well.
Yeah. Anyway, the point is, it was smooth. So the Big Bang, actually all the material was a similar density and constituency. It was a very smooth beginning. There weren't clumps of stuff. If there had been clumps of stuff, in other words, if it would have been ragged, then actually there would have been turbulence, and what would have happened is these clumps would have formed into black holes, and there would have been a universe of black holes and nothing else. But because the beginning of the universe was incredibly smooth, then there were no clumps, it wasn't ragged, and so no black holes developed right at the very, very beginning. And the chance of this happening is 1 in 10 to the 10,123. Now, to give you some idea how unlikely this is, you're more likely to win the lottery every single day of your life than for that to happen. Is it likely or unlikely?
Impossible.
True question.
If it happens 7 times in a row, the police will be round at your door, wondering how you fiddled the balls. The likelihood of this happening is zilch. Out of 10 to the 10,123, that's the number of noughts. 10,123. Anyway, that's the number of noughts. One in those numbers is seriously impossible. Also, there's something called the expansion problem. So to avoid not recollapsing within a fraction of a second, or expanding so fast the galaxy is never condensed, it's another physicist, R.H. Dickey, he calculated that a 1 part in a million speed decrease when the Big Bang was 1 second old would have led to a recollapse before the temperature fell below 10,000 degrees. A similar increase and the stars would never have formed. So you can imagine, if it had been going 1 part in a million slower, then it never would have got to the point of developing into a universe that it just would have collapsed back in on itself. If it had been 1 part in a million too fast, it never would have, it just would have carried on going and galaxies and things never would have formed. Yeah? So kind of unlikely, isn't it? Yeah. And so sometimes people say, well, you know, maybe the universe is just going like this and one day it just appeared right. But actually, you know, it's, you only get 2 chances. Either it's too fast once and it's never going to come back again to re-explode, yeah? You can't have this pulsating universe, that's an impossibility. It's only a 1 part in a million chance of it being the right thing, not 1 in 2. Just has to get it wrong once and it's finished. So, again, we look at the weak nuclear force. This is what controls proton fusion. I can't remember where it is. So if it's a little bit stronger, all the matter in the universe would have become helium heavier elements, and there'd be no water because there'd be no, you know, hydrogen. So there'd be no water, so there'd be no life. And also the sun would explode instead of burning. If it's a little bit weaker, there'd be only helium, since the weak nuclear force makes neutrons decay to protons, which means you're going to have larger elements. Yeah, so that's exactly what it needs to be. Again, the strong nuclear force, there's 2% increase and quarks will not turn into protons and there'll be no hydrogen. A 5% weakening, the strong nuclear force would unbind the deuteron, which is proton-neutron, which is part of the nucleus, and there'll be no elements heavier than hydrogen. So again, there'll be no life or anything. Anyway, there's electromagnetism. So again, a change of just 1 part in 10 to the 40 would affect star formation. Slightly stronger, and they would be red stars and too cold. Slightly weaker, and they would be blue, very hot, radioactive, and short-lived. A double strength in electromagnetism would mean 10 to the 62 years would be needed for life to evolve, by which time all the protons would have decayed. In other words, there would be no universe left. Again, gravity is 10 to the 39 times weaker than electromagnetism. A slight change in this proportion would prevent the formation of stars. At its actual strength, it was possible for clouds to form stable stars which do not fragment. And there's loads of other things about this. You know, these are just a few of these. I can't remember what they're called now. Anyway, things, constants. The laws of nature have to be exactly and precisely what they are. Otherwise, there would be no universe and there would be no human life. And so, how can we explain this? You know, I said, you add up all these numbers, you can say, well, that's an absolute impossibility. So how can we explain it? Well, some people say, well, it just happens to be like this. You know, let's avoid that question, in other words, you know, because the implication of that question. Another way of saying, well, there's a multiple universe that exists and ours just happens to support life. In other words, there's an infinite number of universes, and the universe we live in is the universe which supports life. So if you have an infinite number of universes, you'd expect at least one of them to fulfill all these conditions with these massive numbers and for there to be life. Okay. So what do you think about that argument? Well, what do you think about the first argument, first of all?
A bit lazy.
Lazy, isn't it? What about the second argument?
A bit too imaginative.
Why?
I mean, what's it based on? I mean, there's no proof of multiple universes.
Okay, so some people can say that's a possible implication of the equations. But there again, the question is there any evidence for the existence of universes other than our own? No, there isn't. It's a postulation. And so according to Occam's razor, you know Occam's razor? Now the simplest explanation is the most likely. Yeah. You know, why postulate all these imaginary things? Why not just accept the simplest explanation, that there is only one universe, the universe in which we live, until we have evidence for other universes. It's interesting where this idea of multiple universes came from. This idea came from the Soviet Union. The Soviet philosophers came up with this idea because when in the 20s and later in the 50s, 60s, the idea of a Big Bang came to be accepted scientific knowledge that the universe had a beginning. Then of course this raised the question: well, maybe God exists. Maybe it's God. Where could the universe come from? Well, maybe there is a creator. God created the universe. And so the way around this is to say, well, actually there's a multiple universe, an infinite number of universes, and this is the way in which you can dispense with God. So that's maybe historical interest, that this idea of multiple universes came from Soviet philosophy and science. Because the idea of the Big Bang raised all these inconvenient questions about God. Here, another explanation is an intelligent creator designed the initial conditions to support the development of complexity, life and consciousness. In other words, that there is a God, and God did all the sums, and he realized and basically God drew up the recipe for the Big Bang. Did all the sums, this is the amount of energy we need, these are the laws we need, this is the strength of the forces we need, all these things, and then there can be a universe which eventually will produce complexity, life and consciousness. So in that sense, God wrote the recipe. So God designed the recipe for the creation such that he created a world, a universe, which eventually would become more and more complex, such that eventually life would appear and consciousness would appear. Okay? So this idea, which I think is quite attractive, God is a cook.
God is a what?
God's a cook.
Oh, cool.
Can you imagine you go into a kitchen, you want to bake a cake, and you never baked a cake. Supposedly, it's like Ready Steady Cook, but a new variety of Ready Steady Cook. What you do is you're blindfolded, and you go into the kitchen and you're told to bake a cake. And so you don't know where anything is, you open the cupboard, you try and work out, is this a packet of flour? And then you try and find a mixing bowl and you put it on the scales, of course you can't see the scales, and you try and put the flour and you estimate the amount of flour, and you go to the fridge, try and find some butter and try to get the right amount of butter and this, and then you've got the oven which you don't know because you never use a particular oven again. You try and find the knob and you hope you've got the right knobs here, and you put it in and you can't see the clock, so you hope it's been in the right amount of time. Would it work? What's the likelihood of you coming out with a cake that is edible?
Pretty small.
Pretty small, isn't it? Yeah. So that's how likely. So you can imagine that's unlikely. So when you look at those numbers for the universe, the likelihood of the universe coming out the way that it is microscopic. It's basically zero. So you've got to say, well, somebody must have drawn up the recipe really, really accurately. It must be somebody intelligent who really knew what he was doing, or she was doing, what it was doing. There's a being, an incredibly intelligent being, extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary power that started and sparked the whole thing off.
Does Stephen Hawking, is this his philosophy, or is this his, or is this just,
No,
is he trying to disprove?
No, I just made it up myself.
Oh. No, but is he trying to disprove the fact that an intelligent creator?
No, I don't think so.
Oh.
Because he realises it's not a scientific question.
His words before the great notes, actually.
And it's a question scientists can't answer. And he recognises that. So, which is more believable then, God or chance? Yeah. So Einstein again said, when I see the glories of the cosmos, I can't help but believe there is a divine hand behind it all. The qualification that, as I say, caveat that Einstein didn't believe in a personal God. And, he was aware there's something, mystery behind it all. Okay, so let's have a look at unification thought, see what it says about this. The direction and development of the universe was determined through the function of reason on the basis of the operation of laws, which already existed within the inner Hyung-Sang, in the mind of God, even prior to God's creation of the universe. In other words, law had been prepared from the very beginning for the realization of purpose. In other words, God, in his inner Hyungsang, reason on the basis of laws. This is the idea of logos, reason which can freely create and imagine things, laws which are, some things which are unimaginable, which you can't do. And so God then thought about it all, and using reason based upon law, prepared, the thing so that there would be a universe, which could realise the purpose for which he created it, which was the appearance of consciousness and human beings who could have a relationship of parent and child with him, and in which he could dwell and reside and experience the universe. So again, this is ideas supported by unification thought. So God planned it out like this. That there would be a big bang which would lead to development of complexity, consciousness and life. Okay, third part of our little talk. How are we doing for time?
Halfway. For about 25.
Alright, okay, so we'll have a little whiz through. Oh, it's there, is it? Oh, thank you. Have a look at God versus Darwin now. Okay, so have a look at this discussion. Okay, so when we turn to the Bible, has this little story, a creation myth of the 6 days of creation. So the question is this fact, fiction, or a myth, or something else? So this comes down, first of all, to how do we understand the Bible? So some people understand the Bible in a literal way. Now we call them fundamentalists. They mostly come from America, fundamentalist Protestants. And it's not a traditional Christian perspective on the Bible. It's a very recent understanding. Fundamentalism only appeared in the end of the 19th century. This is the view that the Bible is the inerrant word of God. In other words, every single word in the Bible comes from God, and the prophets were taking dictation. As God dictated the Bible, God wrote the Bible in that sense. And so therefore the Bible is literally true. So if the Bible says it, it should be understood literally. So the Bible says that God created the universe in 6 days. God created the universe in 6 days, and each of these days is 24 hours long, as we know. Yeah, that's
Raymond says, when you put God versus Darwin, I didn't know they were competing.
Darwin certainly wasn't competing with God, but some people think of it like that.
Yeah.
They think, a good point. Maybe I should change the title. Darwin certainly didn't see himself as that. Very interesting quote, I can't remember that. Anyway, so another way of understanding, looking at the Bible, is to understand it in its context. So just as if you read a piece of poetry, and you read this piece of poetry, and you thought, well, this poetry is not really a very good description of this flower, is it? It's not very accurate. You're making a mistake, because poetry is poetry, and if you read poetry and you think it's prose, you've made a mistake. Yes, the different genres of literature. So when we read things, we have to understand what is its genre. And also the meaning of a text depends upon its context. Yes? And text should be examined rationally, and the Bible then contains many metaphors and symbols. So for example, it says in the Bible, God is a rock. What does it mean we should go around, worshipping rocks? And it's just different genres. The Bible itself is a whole mixture. It's not a single book. Lots of different books, lots of different genres. Some of it's myth, some of it's poetry, some of it's law, some of it's history, some of it's, all sorts of different things. So,
question from Hien.
Yeah, hi Hien.
She wants to understand the relationship between science and religion. And also a question, I just wonder who wrote the Bible.
Okay, the Bible was written by lots of different people. And so, for example, in the New Testament, there's 4 Gospels about the life of Jesus, and each of these Gospels was basically written by one person, but there are probably several different editors. The letters of Paul were written by Paul. And we look at what we call the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. Again, different books were written by different people. And over history, then it was re-edited and re-edited. So nobody really knows. We know some of the people who did some of the editing, but nobody knows who wrote a lot of it originally. Because a lot of it was transmitted orally, and then later written down, and sometimes there were different versions of the same story, so sometimes people splice these things together.
There was a lot missed out, and also it was written a long time after
Different parts are written at different times. I said a lot of it was transmitted orally, and we don't know. It's the basic answer. So, what's a traditional perspective on the way we should understand the Bible? Again, turn to the Pope. John Paul II said the Bible itself speaks to us of the origin of the universe and its makeup, not in order to provide us with a scientific treatise, but in order to state the correct relationships of man with God and with the universe. So all the Pope is doing here is he's articulating the traditional Christian understanding of the Bible. The Bible is not to be understood as a scientific treatise. So fundamentalist Christians who do understand it in that way, they're falling outside the Christian tradition. It's a new idea. It's not the traditional Christian idea. So, let's have a look at this story in Genesis. The word, which in English was translated as day, in the Hebrew, this word means age. And, when you look something up in a dictionary, to translate from one language to another, you look up this word, and there's usually 4 or 5 or 6 different possible translations, and you have to pick one of these translations. The word itself may mean 5 or 6 different things, but when you translate it, you're having to eliminate a lot of these different meanings. So the Hebrew word is much more ambiguous in that sense. It just means age, a period of time. But when it is translated in English, the translator thought, well, day sounds nice. It's poetical, on the first day as opposed to on the first age. Sounds nicer. So, a lot of these things are to do with translation. Anyway, so as I said, Jews have never believed that God created the world literally in 6 days, because that's not what the Hebrew Bible says. So one age then could be a day, 24 hours long, or it could be millions or even billions of years. It's just a period of time. Anyway, so the first day the Bible says, let there be light. Science talked about the beginning of the universe, the origin of the universe being a big bang and a huge explosion of light. So again, the biblical account doesn't disagree with the modern scientific account. Let there be light and explode, a big bang, explosion of light. A second day, the Bible says, let the upper and lower waters be separated. So that means that there's waters on the surface of the earth. There's also water up in the atmosphere, 2 layers of water. So what do scientists say, geologists say about this? Again, these are scientists are still trying to figure out how these things happen. And one idea is that the earth was very hot, and so the water on the surface of the earth was constantly evaporating. And so there was a very, very dense cloud cover all around the earth was surrounded by very, very dense clouds all the time, because the earth was so warm and hot. So you have the core of the earth, which is still hot. You'd have the sea, the lower waters, and then you'd have the sky, and then you have the upper waters, just very, very dense cloud cover. And so on the third day, it says, let the land appear, and the land be separated from the sea, and let the plants appear. Okay. So from a scientific point of view, again, scientists are still trying to work this out. This is just one theory, they don't know, one idea, is that the earth, as it was cooling, when things cool, they shrink. So as the earth was shrinking, it cooled and it shrunk, but then a bubble of land appeared. Just as if you try to, squeeze a balloon between your fingers, how bubbles start appearing. Yes? If you try and compress a balloon, bits start appearing between your fingers. It's almost impossible, isn't it? So as the earth then was shrinking, cooling and shrinking, then a bubble of land appeared. And then, of course, in the Bible it says that plants are the first organisms. So again, from a scientific point of view, it's plants that were the first organisms. So here you've got this lump of land appearing. And so then you have the sea and the land and the atmosphere. And so that's why, again from a geological point of view, from the point of view of geologists, all the land once was all clumped together in one place. Sometimes people call it Gondwana land, sometimes there are other names for it, Pangaea or something. And if you look at the continents, you can see that they once fitted together. South America there used to fit into Africa, and all the bits like a jigsaw puzzle when it first started, and then gradually, it all sort of drifted apart, and it's been drifting around.
England was attached to Europe at one point.
Never.
Let's not bring this up.
Kinda. It was the sea levels were lower, and so underneath
There's lots of things
there was
going
no
on
ocean
anyway.
between the two. So
Britain as a whole has a different geological origin to the continent of Europe. It does.
That's a great quote.
That's why I got the Great Rift in Scotland. No, not the Great Rift, it's the thing where Loch Ness is.
Was that the name?
That's one name gone. There's nobody living there naming it at the time. It was just one of the names people have given it since.
You just said, what was that? Britain on the whole has a...
Let's not go there. I can't remember the geology of it. I just remember that Britain has a different geological origin and innate structure to the continent of Europe.
Isn't that what they call a supercontinent?
Yes, that's right. Anyway, so plants appeared. So again, it's a biblical idea, but also a scientific idea. The plants appeared in the sea. And then, anyway, the fourth day in the Bible, it says, "Let the sun and moon and the stars appear." And what about that idea? Is there any problems there? No? Come on, think about it. Let the moon and the sun and the stars appear. Yes?
Is it saying the sun's rising at the same time as the moon?
No. It's saying, it's giving... Carry on. Yeah, anybody else?
As the clouds start evaporating.
Yeah, but there's obviously a problem here. It's saying that it's giving the impression that God created the sun and the moon and the stars after He created the earth. Okay, from the point of view of science, that's wrong. Because the sun is older than the earth, as far as I know. So, they didn't start appearing.
As the clouds start clearing, start seeing.
Right, so what seems to be wrong? So as the earth cooled and the plants generated oxygen, then the atmosphere changed, and eventually you get the ozone layer and all these things, and then the sky became visible. Okay? And so then the sun and the moon would have appeared. So this story then is an extraordinary act of imagination. Somebody is imagining, supposing somebody was, again they're all sitting around a cave, sitting around a campfire, discussing all these things, all got their ideas, trying to explain this thing, got nothing else to do, no TV to watch, no Big Brother to take up your time. And trying to figure out theories to explain the origin of the universe. And somebody said, well, it's an extraordinary act of creative imagination, trying to describe how it developed. And so somebody imagining that they were standing on the surface of the earth, imagined that at some point the sun and the stars and the moon appeared. Because at that point, cloud cover disappeared. It's extraordinary act of this ideas. Nobody knows who came up with these ideas. They're amazing. And then anyway, so it says on the fifth day, let the fish and the birds appear. So again, it says that life developed first in the seas, which again, from the understanding of modern biology, life didn't appear on the land. It appeared first, plants appeared, then life, organisms appeared in the sea, and then later on, you had organisms appearing on the land. And on the sixth day, let the creatures appear. And so you got frog there, amphibians, then you got reptiles, and you got mammals. And then finally, the last creature to appear were human beings. And again, from the perspective of evolutionary biology, we know also that human beings are the last mammals, as far as we understand, to appear, the most recent appearance in the evolutionary timetable. So, what I think is remarkable here, what's remarkable, despite what the Pope says, what is remarkable is that the order of creation in Genesis is very similar to that proposed by modern science. So it's like a story, and if you understand the story correctly, you can see it doesn't conflict with modern science. The only thing is, you've got birds appearing before land creatures. So modern science is actually birds evolved from reptiles. Yeah. So that's the only apparent error. Okay. So it's extraordinary, act of a creative imagination. Yeah.
Can I just say something about people taking the Bible literally? I was watching Big Question on Sunday. I don't know if anyone ever watches it. So BBC
What do you know again?
One of the they do 3 questions, 20 minutes each, and one of the questions was about women in the church and becoming bishops and all the rest of it. And there was this man, and he was taking everything from the Bible and just saying, the Bible says women shouldn't be. And I was sitting, when you start arguing with people, or in my mind, I was thinking, but why are you, you're not even using your feelings, your common sense, or, to take something just that's written as just the truth, nothing but the truth, is so rigid. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, but they're taking it,
literally.
Right, so they're taking it out of context, and also often just picking the verses which they want, whereas actually if you take the whole thing, it's much more rounded.
Yes.
And just taking things out of context, picking the verses they want. Okay, so this is the question then, how did all these living creatures appear? So one solution is each kind is separately created by God. So this is the argument of creationism, that God designed every single creature individually and created every single creature, and that's why they're all different. So God created mosquitoes, and God created antelopes, and God created every single species that exists. Yeah? That's creationism. God created each one, designed and created each one. Well, the alternative is they evolved from each other. So this is the inside of Darwin Act, that one thing evolved into another, one kind of creature or being changed into another one. They're all connected together. And so let's have a look at Darwin and God. And anyway, as a young man, Darwin believed in traditional Christianity. He was studying to be a priest. And he was studying, as far as I remember, at Cambridge University. But anyway, before he became a priest, he was invited, he was also interested in science, because his father, Erasmus Darwin, was also interested in science, and it's not that Darwin actually came up with the theory of evolution, because the idea of evolution is just a traditional English understanding of the way the world works. It came from David Hume, and when you study history, you can see how institutions evolve. Yeah? Nobody actually designed Parliament. It's just a product of often accidental changes and modifications and incremental changes, and all the institutions have evolved. And when you actually look at them, you think, well, nobody designed it to be like this. It's just a product of lots of incremental changes. So this is a common understanding within English political culture of the evolution of political institutions through the historical process and the incremental changes and often blind changes that people made to solve a particular problem today. Let's do this, but then this particular solution had all sorts of unintended and unexpected consequences, some good and some bad. Anyway, so Darwin grew up in this kind of environment where these sort of things are common currency, evolution. Anyway, so later on he lost faith in Christian doctrines, and he went on his voyage, and he was associating sailors who were very rough and ready, and who found all these contradictions within the Bible. And anyway, he said, as a result of his scientific studies, that I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent, in other words, a kind and loving God, an all-powerful God, would have designedly, deliberately created parasitic wasps with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars. So he found a particular species of caterpillar, and in this particular species of caterpillar, he found there was a parasitic wasp that couldn't live anywhere else other than in this particular species of caterpillar. In other words, this parasitic wasp laid its eggs inside the caterpillar, and the eggs hatched inside the caterpillar and killed the caterpillar, and then the wasp would fly off. And he thought, that's not very nice. And why would God do that? Was it necessary? If that parasitic wasp didn't exist, would the world fall to pieces? Was it necessary that a loving God?
Also, we've got to take into consideration what the wasp does once it's flown away. It must have a common purpose.
Well, he studied it all, and his conclusion was, having studied it, he's an extraordinary biologist, having studied all these things, he realised his conclusion was it wasn't necessary. In other words, why did God do it? Surely God could have found, if God really needed this kind of wasp to be flying around doing something else, why couldn't he found a nicer way of it being able to multiply? In other words, why did it have to lay its eggs inside this caterpillar and make the caterpillar's life misery? Why couldn't he have designed it so that the wasp would lay its eggs on a leaf somewhere? That was his question. Why did it have to be like this? If God designed it all, why didn't he do a better job of it? Why did he create a world in which there's so much, a natural world in which there is so much suffering as he saw it? And so his conclusion was, he couldn't believe in the Christian understanding of God, God is almighty and God is all powerful, and that God designed every single little bit, and the wasps and the mosquitoes and everything else, which in Africa bring malaria and all these. Was it not possible to have done it without malaria-bearing mosquitoes? These kind of questions. If you assume that God created every single thing and God designed every single species, then it raised the question, why did God do it? And then it raised the question of the goodness of God. Is God really good if he did this, created a world in which there's so much unnecessary suffering? And so for Darwin then, he came to doubt the traditional Christian doctrine of God. He couldn't believe in that and believe in what he discovered through science, because he couldn't reconcile the traditional doctrine of God with what he discovered as a biologist and a zoologist. And then also, later on, his daughter, who he loved very much, was very, very close to him, very dear, when she went through a long disease, a huge amount of suffering, and she died. Right, and so again, this raised the question, this question, he couldn't believe in a God which is all good and almighty. In other words, he couldn't believe in the traditional Christian doctrine of God, which was predestinarian and all sorts of things. Okay, but he wasn't an atheist, he just couldn't believe in the Christian doctrine of God. He still believed in God, but not the Christian understanding of God. He became more of an agnostic, but he was never an atheist, and he never thought that his ideas contradicted or go against believing in the existence of God. So, Darwin then, he argued in favour of evolution and against separate creation. He argued against the idea that every single being is created separately, but he argued in favour of the idea that one thing has evolved from another thing. He denied separate creation, but he was not an atheist. And so, for Darwin, he thought it's possible to argue that evolution was the process through which God worked. And so when we look at the way in which, later on, the way in which Darwin was received, we'll see that actually this is how Christian theologians in Britain and America at the time, they saw the theory of evolution as the process through which God worked, as seen as no contradiction between Darwin's ideas and Christian theology. Okay, so let's have a quick look. Some people don't believe in evolution, so let's have a look briefly at the evidence for evolution. One is homology. So when we look at, these are the common features that are present due to common ancestors. So for example, a 5-fingered hand is common to humans, bats, porpoises, etc. So if you look at a salamander, which is a reptile, as far as I remember, it's got five, you look at the number of bones there, it's actually got 5 fingers, one of the fingers are very small. Look at a toad, which is an amphibian, again it's got 5 fingers in its hand. You look at a crocodile, which is a very primitive reptile, again it's got 5 fingers. You look at a bird, again it's got 5 fingers, which is sort of organised in a certain way. A bat's got 5 fingers, a whale's got 5 fingers, a mole has got 5 fingers, well 6 there because one bone's changed into another extra finger, but same number of bones there. and a human being's also got 5. So this is the thing, why have they all got 5 fingers? Well, the evolutionary argument is at some point in the evolutionary thing, 5 fingers developed, and all the things that came later all descended from that, and that's why they all have 5 fingers. There's sort of a choice made in the evolutionary sort of branch. And you might think, well, maybe God just designed all these things with 5 fingers. That's another way of thinking about it. But then, you have to think about this. When people design things, is that the way people design things? How many wheels do motor vehicles have?
4, most of 3.
Well, okay, most cars have got 4 wheels, because that's what works best for a car. But trucks have to carry heavier things, so often small trucks have got 6 wheels. Because they're lorries, which are bigger and carry heavier loads and are longer, they have maybe 14 wheels. Tanks have got 2 tracks because they go across a different kind of terrain. A motorbike usually have 2 wheels, some have got 3 wheels. Tricycles have got 3 wheels. So each one has a number of wheels that is best for a particular purpose. So when you design something, you design it for the best particular purpose. So you wouldn't go around saying, well, actually, the first person that designed a motor vehicle had 4 wheels, therefore all the other ones we're going to design, we have to follow the same pattern and also have 4 wheels. It doesn't work like that. So you think, well, if God actually designed every single individual species, you'd think he'd design each one that was best adapted to its particular environment. And some may want 4 fingers, some may better with 10. Some maybe don't need any fingers. Yeah? So, but the fact that they all have 5 fingers suggests that they all have a common origin. They're all modifications of the same pattern. Yeah? So they all have a common ancestor, and they're all modifications of that same common ancestor. The variations on a theme, whereas the motor vehicles, which are individually designed, aren't variations on a theme, because they're all designed to fulfill a particular purpose, a particular niche. Yeah. What other evidence is there for evolution? Well, all known life is based upon DNA. Doesn't matter where you go in the earth, drill down a couple of miles underneath the surface of the earth, you'll find little bacteria, DNA. There are a few things based just on RNA. Basically everything's based on DNA. If you go down to the bottom of the ocean, you find these vents where hot water comes out. There's life down there based on DNA. Human beings based on every single living organism. All life is based upon DNA. So it has something in common. You wouldn't think that it was individually designed, separate creation. Why wouldn't you do it instead of on DNA, do it based on something else? It's this idea that everything's based on DNA suggests that all life is one. DNA is the most complex molecule in the entire universe.
But Darwin wouldn't have done that, would he?
No, he wouldn't. But this is just So Darwin came up with this theory. Again, it's an extraordinary act of imagination. From Origin of the Species was published 150 years ago. 51 years ago. An extraordinary act of the imagination. But all the scientific discoveries which have come subsequently, such as DNA and genetics and everything, have only confirmed his basic insights. Yeah. Again, the fossil record, new species appears, again the growth in complexity. Again, there are lots of gaps. So this is some evidence for evolution. And anyway, some people say, some people disagree, and they say, well, everything's actually so complicated, it must have been designed. So is complexity proof of design? So one person who came up with this idea was William Paley, one of the more recent people who articulated this idea. He's a theologian and scientist, and he said, nature contains every manifestation of design. Design must have a designer, that designer must have been a person, that person is God. That's his argument. So his argument went along like this. Supposing you're walking along a heath, and you came across and you stubbed your toe on a rock, and you got all excited, wow, look, there's a rock here. You wouldn't be surprised to find a rock. But supposing you came across a watch, you would be surprised. Why would you be surprised by a rock? Well, that's just what you would expect to find. Or supposing you're walking along a beach, sometimes you find these sort of pebbles, and you pick them up, and they've got all sorts of amazing patterns. And sometimes people say, oh, God made it like this. God designed it so they could have this pattern in here, so when I walked along the beach I could find it and see something so incredibly beautiful. What do you think about people who talk like that?
Very romantic.
Romantic. I think that I think that's loopy, to be honest. Because God didn't design it. It's just purely by chance, going up and down for thousands and tens of thousands of years. You would expect just by chance there to be rocks with that kind of pattern. Yeah, just by chance. And somebody gets really excited about it, think God designed it like that. Send them to the Brazilian bin.
My wife won't be happy about that. She's quite a strong believer in it. You could say that indirectly it has been designed in the sense that God set out the principle through which those patterns were able to develop. And in that sense there's something of God in that pattern, in the
but God didn't actually design that particular
not
one.
literally, no.
No, it just came about by chance.
No, so
of course, God set up the rules and the laws, and as I said, the Big Bang and everything. And yes, according to those, then laws of chance, these sort of things appear. But they're not the product of design. Design suggests something conscious, that you actually come up with a design, and then you implement that design. So nobody, in that sense, designed that rock to have that particular kind of pattern in it.
But could God, just as you've spoken about scientists having an active imagination, couldn't God have had that same kind of active imagination and been able to imagine the potential results of his principles and theory?
God has an incredible actual imagination, which is the whole Big Bang.
Yeah.
Together with reason and law and imagination, he designed something so that eventually complexity would appear. But he didn't actually design that particular rock to have that particular pattern. If he did, how did he do it? Where's his design studio? If you think God designed it like that, how did he do it? What is the mechanism by which God designed it and made it appear there at that particular moment when you were there with that particular pattern which you were going to impute that particular meaning to?
That's a good question.
I think the whole world, wherever you are, whether it's the Seychelles, or New Zealand, or UK, everything, whatever, the rocks, the sand, there's a lot of beauty all around. And it's just fortunate. And actually, the fact that we have a Big Bang, as you say, things are developing all the time, forming all the time, depending on how we treat it. For instance, we're losing our underwater beauty, aren't we, with all that's going on, the fossils and so on, we're losing that. So it just happens to be that things either erode and get destroyed, or they develop, or they bash against each other and form beauty.
Right. It's just, so Paley's came on, so he said if you came across this kind of rock, you wouldn't think there was a designer, you would just realise it's just a product of natural processes. It's just these sort of things appear as a result of natural processes. That's all. Whereas, so he said, if you came walking along the beach and you found a watch, you would see that actually it's not the product of the natural processes. You can see it's extraordinarily complex, and it obviously was designed. Somebody designed it. Somebody with intelligence designed it, and somebody with extraordinary skill made it. Yeah, it's a product of intelligence and skill, and you can actually go along to a watchmaker's place and you can see it happening. So if you thought, well, that's just a product of chance, if somebody said, well, it just came about by chance, just like this rock is a product of chance, this happens in this rock, it's just by a natural process and chance, and so this watch just is a product of natural process and chance, you'd think that person deserves to go to the loony bin. Because somebody has said, grandfather clock with all these, intricate wheels, oh, that's just by chance, that's all you just take a box, you put it all in, you shake it, and you shake it enough times and it'll come out like that. You don't need anybody to actually design it and to do it. You think that guy doesn't know the way the world works. So again, one is this sort of religious imperialism, where you impute God's design into everything, and the others, Anyway, so this is his argument then. Nature contains every manifestation of design. Design must have a designer. That designer must have been a person. That person's God. So that's the argument. Okay. So the question is it possible for complexity to come about spontaneously without being the product of design? And historically and traditionally, people have said no. If there's something which is incredibly complex, that reveals conscious design. And that's. So this is the question, can order and complexity come about naturally? Well, yes, they can. So these are called what are called self-organizing systems. And this is the result of very modern discoveries within science. It's possible for things of extraordinary complexity to develop naturally. And you can watch this video here. There's a YouTube thing there. It's called Order... what's it called? The Life of Chaos, showing that actually chaos has order within it. Anyway, so you can find these things in physics. That's a Turing structure. So Turing, the English mathematician, the first person to develop the mathematics of this self-organizing systems. And you can find it in chemistry and biology, in mathematics and computing, cybernetics, and economics and society. And for example, Alan Turing, that's right. Develops maths behind computing. And so, for example, the market. People say the market is chaotic, but actually the market is incredibly complex. Extraordinary. The market, what we call the economy, is something extraordinary complexity, but it's not the product of design. Nobody designed the market. If you go to a market, nobody designed it. It's just somebody set out the stalls. Somebody, and you could rent your little patch, but nobody designed who's going to be in which place. It just happens. It's a self-generated order, and it changes. And language, for example, is incredibly complex. There are rules of language, but again, the language is not something which has been designed. It's a self-generated, self-organizing system. It's really interesting. I can't explain it. You actually have to see it. These sort of things that actually happen. If you look at this thing here, it's possible for complexity just to develop in a self-organized way. So what about the human eye? So it's a classic example for both creationists and Darwinists. And Darwin. And some people say, well, the human eye is so incredibly complex, it's impossible for it to come about by chance. Yes? It couldn't have come about by random mutation, natural selection, therefore it must have been designed. So sometimes people say, well, we've got eyebrows here, it must have been designed, how could all these things know it needed to have this? And, but then, in terms of biological theory and zoology, actually there are many different types of eye that exist from a single spot to the very complex. And so there may be an organism which has got a few cells, and one of these cells, for whatever reason, may have become light sensitive. This would have given this particular organism an advantage over other organisms which didn't have this light sensitive thing. It meant it knew when it was light, which might have helped it to be attracted towards light for photosynthesis. It might have been able to recognize the light to hide. It might have been able to recognize light for all kinds of reasons. And so it gave it an evolutionary advantage over organisms which didn't. And then also, again, it could develop to something that's slightly more complex. So there are, within the natural world today, there's a whole range of eyes, from the simple light-sensitive cell to the incredibly complex human eye. And you get something which has got a couple of light-sensitive cells, and maybe one which is slightly better. And then it's able to spot prey, and so you're able to go and hunt your prey because you could recognize them somehow. And then if the prey suddenly realized it was at an evolutionary disadvantage, and then prey, which happened to develop a light-sensitive cell which is able to recognize the predator, is more likely to survive than the other ones. The other ones all got eaten up. So it's like a sort of, an arms race, escalating. And so advantageous modifications were selected for. And so it's quite possible for an evolutionary pathway in 400,000 generations to go from a single light-sensitive cell to the human eye. And all the stages in between They exist in the natural world. And so, and you can see sometimes things go backwards. So, for example, there's some amphibians which had an eye, but then they became trapped in an underground situation where there was no light, and they'd actually lose the ability to see because it became redundant. And so you can see how things are modified. That eye no longer became necessary, and so the ability to see was lost. So you can see, just within a very short time, how things do evolve. Within a few generations, things are modified, they change. But what I think is the most significant argument against design is that if God designed things, He's not a very good designer.
Isn't the point then, we just say that the process of evolution is what God came up with as a process?
Yes.
And in terms of the amazing ability and quality of the eye to do all these things, in that sense, God created an incredible process.
Right, so we'll look at that. We'll look at that a bit later. So just try and knock on the head the idea that God created human beings. So, for example, are there any badly designed parts of the human body?
The English football team.
Depends whether you're male or female.
Yes.
The appendix.
That's not badly designed. Okay, it has a function. There's one particular... Yes? Joanna?
I wanted to say, connecting what Simon was saying as well, was that with the eye, there's some people who are blind, but then they develop some other part of their brain can
Because they
function
adapt.
better.
Yeah, so the whole idea of evolution is it's adapt. That you get these advantageous modifications, adaptations, and people or organisms adapt to their environment. And the ones that adapt to their environment successfully are the ones that continue. The other ones get eaten. Or, because they don't adapt to the fact there's now a predator, they die out. If you think of the human body, a lot of people get backache. Why do they get backache? Because actually the lower back is not very strong. Why is the lower back not very strong? Because it wasn't designed to support the upper body. Because before, primates go around on 4 legs. And so the lower back wasn't a weight supporting part, because this part would be supported on the hands, the arms, and the other part supported on the legs. But then at some point, for various reasons, human beings stood upright, became upright beings. But they still had a back which was suited for swinging around in the trees, and primates. And so there's a weakness. So the lower back is very, very weak. It's not strong enough to support the upper body, unless you keep yourself very fit and strong. So there's a weakness. Also, sometimes people get sciatic nerve, because there's a particular nerve that runs down that particular leg. If it had gone through a different place, it wouldn't have been a problem. But because it goes through this particular place, it gets squashed. There's certain problems with the eye, because the nerve in the eye goes the way it does go. There's blind spots and things. If it had gone a different way, if the circuit had been run differently, it would have been different. And so this is the argument against design. If God designed human beings, why has He got so many design faults? Either God's a bad designer, or God didn't design us with a product of gradual modification of it based upon an existing pattern or model, which was more like a sort of hominid, which is a common ancestor for primates and human beings, which is a common ancestor. And before that, there was another common ancestor, which all had the 5 fingers and everything else. So, what's the mechanism of evolution that Darwin advocated? He said that it comes about through natural selection. You get random variations.
And past 9.
Oh, goodness gracious, I'll finish very soon. Going on far too. Anyway, so the question is, random variations. So, well, there are many differences between individuals. Whether these variations are random or not is a question. Okay, but anyway, there are lots of variations between individuals. Some people are more suited than others. The struggle for survival, only a minority of offspring survive and reproduce. They're the ones best adapted to the local ecology. The survival of the fittest. Advantageous adaptations are passed on to the next generation. So Darwinism hasn't got the answer to all the questions, but I said he wrote this book 150 years ago. All the discoveries within zoology and biology and science since then have only confirmed his basic insights and filled out his theory. So Darwinism then is a research program, but it still has many unsolved problems, as does astronomy, as does particle physics, as does every area of science has many unsolved problems. So does the theory of evolution, many unsolved problems, but it's a fruitful research program. Yeah, that is very fruitful. So, for example, what is the source of variation? Don't know. How does speciation occur? Don't know. Problem macroevolution. All these things are problems that scientists are working on. The lack of intermediaries in the fossil record, maybe need to do a bit more digging, I don't know. How did DNA appear? Don't know. There are a lot of unsolved problems, but as I said, it's a fruitful research program. So is Darwinism compatible with belief in God? It depends what you think God is like. So first of all, as I said, how was Darwinism received? Some people think that actually there's a big conflict between Darwin and the church, but actually it's not true. It's a book published by James Moore, by Cambridge University Press, a serious publisher here, who researched the post-Darwinian controversies. And he said in the 19th century, which is the time when Darwin was alive and working, with a few exceptions, the leading Christian thinkers in Great Britain and America came to terms quite readily with Darwinism and evolution. The theory of evolution was not seen as a threat to Christianity, was not seen as a threat to Christian theology, was not seen as a threat to belief in God, was not seen as a threat to the church. Yeah. Fundamentalism is a recent phenomenon that appeared in America about 100 years ago because of their Protestant origins. They didn't have a very broad Catholic Anglican background. And of course you get the same sort of thing appearing in Korea because again most of Christianity came to Korea was also Protestant, fundamentalist, with a literalist interpretation of the Bible, which is why you find some people in the unification movement who, are fundamentalists. And actually it's not the traditional Jewish Christian
So why do you find that? Why do you find that?
Well, because the brand of Christianity that went to Korea is predominantly Protestant. Bible is a literal, inerrant word of God. American fundamentalists, Protestant Christian missionaries went there. They brought their own perspective on the Bible there, and they brought their own prejudices against. And because Korea didn't have the sort of broader and deeper Christian foundation, and understanding the historical Christian perspective in the church. And so you got a lot of people in Korea very anti-Darwin, anti-evolution. And so unfortunately this sort of ideas have infected some branches of the unification movement. They were heresy.
Wandered off into heresy for some reason.
Yeah. So Reverend Charles Kingsley, for example, wrote The Water Babies, again a contemporary of Darwin, professor of theology at Oxford, I think he was. He says, "It's just as noble a conception of deity to believe that he created primal forms capable of self-development, self-generating order, as to believe that he required a fresh act of intervention to supply the gaps which he himself had made." So he said, one view is to think, well, God created every single thing, God's a very active, busy God, going around creating all these things. That's one way. The other way is to see, well, God's created the universe such that it would naturally, spontaneously develop to complexity, life and consciousness. He said it's just as noble a conception of deity as to think that God created this way as that way. It wasn't an issue. If you think God is only immanent, then I don't want to go into this, we're late. If you think God is only transcendent, God is separate from the universe, then you think God creates the universe, matter is inert. This is where this Greek stuff comes in, which I haven't got time to go into, I'm afraid. Anyway, our understanding is that God created the world. It's the Jewish understanding, God created the world, but that also God acts in the world through nature, through natural processes. But also there's the key idea and the principle that God's relationship with the created world is one where the natural world is in the indirect dominion of God. If the natural world is in the indirect dominion of God, how does God go around designing and creating things if it's in the indirect dominion? God doesn't have direct dominion over the natural world. God can only take direct dominion over the natural world through having human beings. So God obviously couldn't have been actively designing all these little species, could he? If it's in the indirect dominion.
That's the final knockout punch.
one of many. Anyway, also, I understand everything as an internal and external dimension. As I said, Plato and Greek philosophy said matter is inert, matter is lifeless, matter is inanimate. And the Greek understanding is order could only come about if it was imposed. And that's the Greek idea, which I didn't explain. And that's the traditional understanding. Anyway, the principal understanding, which is Jewish and Christian, the biblical understanding, is everything has an internal and external dimension. So matter, for example, isn't lifeless. Matter has an inherent directive nature. Matter is alive in some sense. Matter has a song-sang. Yes? Whereas the traditional Greek understanding is pure Heil. It's just hyun-sang without a song-sang. It's lifeless. And therefore, you'd expect, well, that's why God needs to come along and design all these things. Yeah? Because it couldn't happen spontaneously or naturally. But if you understand that actually matter has an inherent directive nature, you recognize there's order in chaos. Whereas the Greek understanding is there's chaos and order has to be imposed upon chaos. And all sorts of political ramifications this. Whereas if you believe there's order within chaos, that everything has a sung-sang, hyung-sang, matter then has a tendency to this inherent directive nature to greater and greater levels of complexity. Naturally forms order and greater levels of complexity. There's an inherent directive nature. This whole philosophical understanding is absent from Greek philosophy, which is why you have to come along with the design thing, which comes from Plato. So also God's hyun-sang, or prime force, is the basis of the force of nature. God is immanent, acting in and through the natural processes.
Hyun-sang is what?
God's hyun-sang is God's universal prime force.
External.
It's the outer dimension of
outer
God.
Dimension.
We talk about the God of heart, God of love and power. The heart, love or heart is like the sung-sang, and it's expressed through God's power. You look at the Bible for that. What's the universal prime force? Okay, fundamental energy of God's being. God is a self-existing. God doesn't need anything. Yeah? God needs nothing. God is a self-existing being. So God doesn't need anything. Yeah? It's the energy, and so this is the acting energy of God's hyun-sang that causes the give and take action. I'll explain this later. The origin of all the forces, the example of gravity, electromagnetism, allow the creative beings to exist. So all these four fundamental forces, they're expressions of the universal prime force. So when scientists understand these four different forces and have equations which describe these four different forces, but these equations don't fit with each other, so what they're trying to find is an equation, which is a sort of super equation, which is able to integrate these four different forces, and that's like a description of the universal prime force. That's what they're trying to describe. So anyway, so this universal prime force directs all interactions towards unity. So for example, if there's no gravity, nothing will work. And the universal prime force, the vertical force, directs towards higher levels and greater levels of complexity. So I'm having to rush through all this. This is a traditional Jewish Christian doctrine. For in him we live and move and have our being. So we live within God. All these forces are an expression of the universal prime force. So gravity is an expression of the universal prime force. So we live and move and have our being within God. So without God, we would not be. And so what is give and take action then? Well, again, there's this interesting idea here, which you can see there's give and take within a subject, initiates a relationship between a subject and an object. So for example, the relationship between mind and body in the subject initiates a relationship with another being, which also have mind-body unity. Does that make sense? Suppose you're sitting playing computer games all day long, and somebody comes into the room. How does the person sitting playing computer games all day long respond? They don't, do they? They don't jump up and say, "Oh, hi, it's nice to see you." There's no mind-body kind of stuff going on. But when there's mind-body dialogue in a dialogue, then you reach out to somebody else. When there's good mind-body unity, you form a relationship with somebody else, and form a couple. You have a family, mind-body unity, interaction between families. Then they form relationships with other families, you get a community. It's sort of bottom up. Oh, sorry, I'm having to jump through all this. I want to spend more time on this. So anyway, so it says here, universal prime force is vertical. Give and take action within the subject and object is caused by the universal prime force, which initiates relationship between the subject and object. So the interaction which is going on a horizontal level initiates to a high level of complexity. So when you've got give and take going on within a family, there's a horizontal give and take within a family, and then your natural reaction, why don't we make friends with another family? Yes, and then we invite them around for a barbecue. So that creates several families, and you get several families together, it creates a community. Then you get a strong sense of community. Why don't we make a relationship with other communities? And you get communities interact, you get a society. So you can see going from individual, family, society, nation and world. It's bottom up. As Father says, world peace starts with an individual, mind-body unity, bottom up. The universal prime force is a vertical force working to going from initiating interactions on greater and greater levels of complexity. And so, and it says here, unification thought. It says it there, Acts there, you can read it. So I'm just rushing through this, that. Okay, so the creation, unification of the creation is harmonious in its myriad forms, regardless of the countless types of give and take action initiated by the universal prime force. In other words, through universal prime force, give and take action is directed by a unifying purpose, and through its organic relationships generates the forces necessary for existence, reproduction, action of all things, from the smallest to the largest. And finally, the goal and direction of all give and take action are controlled by the universal prime force. So all these are the forces which we talked about, the force of gravity, the strong, weak electromagnetic forces, nuclear forces, these are the forces. Give and take action exists not only so a subject and object can fulfill their individual purposes, but also for the greater purpose of unifying all things. The ultimate purpose of give and take action is to have subject and object unite and develop to a higher and greater dimension. So this is because everything has this sung sang kyung sang, the universal prime force. So it's that God created the universe with the sung sang kyung sang, with these universal prime forces. So naturally it would move to greater and greater levels of complexity. So that one day God knew that one day life would appear somewhere in the universe, and one day life would appear with consciousness. One day human beings would appear, which could become the temple in which he could dwell in his image and likeness. And so happened to be human beings. Yeah. I don't think God knew we were going to look like this. I think he knew that some beings would appear somewhere in the universe that would be able to form a relationship with him. And, I think it's just... the interesting thing I love about this is wherever you look, wherever scientists look, they find wherever it's possible for life to appear, life appears. Yeah? It's just the whole universe is teeming with life. If it's possible, because everything got sung-sang, universal prime force. Wherever it's possible for life to appear, life will appear. So it's quite possible in other planets and other parts of the universe there is life. Who knows? Because I think that's just the way God created the universe, so that life would appear somewhere. It's not that he thought, I'm going to create the planet Earth and I'm going to design this and this and this and this. I think, God just actually enjoyed watching all these things appear. I think this is, a remarkable thing. So I'll just terminate now.
Thank you.
Alright, anyway, thank you for being so patient. I'm sorry for talking so long. I got sort of too bogged down in some of these bits and pieces.
We'll have to start on time next week.
Yeah, so it's we started late, and that's my excuse.
A little bit, yeah.
So it actually was 2 hours, wasn't it?
Yeah, and the origin of, not the species, the origin of that problem was didn't have a key to the door.
Oh, that's right.
It all started from the key.
That's right, the lack of design.
Lack of logistical planning.
Okay, thanks, Brenda.
See you next week.
Yeah.
You next week?
Yes, I will. Yeah, next week is about governance, so it's
Okay.
politics and economics.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Sorry, I haven't got my tea.